Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Nicodemo Scarfo, the man who once ruled Philadelphia with quiet confidence and absolute control. Known for his intensity, discipline, and pride, Scarfo believed that power demanded both respect and loyalty. Before we begin, like this video. We're aiming for 100 likes in this video, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support motivates us to bring you even more fascinating stories from the underworld. Now, settle in and let the story of Nicodemo Scarfo guide you into the night. He was born in Brooklyn in 1929, the son of immigrants who carried old-world hopes into crowded American blocks. The family moved to South Philadelphia, where row houses pressed shoulder to shoulder, and every corner had its own pecking order. He was small in stature, quick to anger, fast with a glare. The nickname came early. It fit his size, but also the impatience in him that grew faster than his years. He wanted to be noticed, to never be pushed aside, to stand taller than nature had allowed. In that neighborhood, there were men who didn't wait for permission. They wore tailored suits and spoke softly while making big things happen. The boy watched, learned who sat where in a cafe, learned who took envelopes, learned who could settle an argument with a glance. Respect looked like a quiet nod from a man at a corner table, and he hungered for that nod. By the late 1940 seconds and early 1950 seconds, he worked small errands for people already connected to the Philadelphia organization that controlled gambling, loans, and unions. The structure had rules, ranks, and a code that punished anyone who broke it. He wanted in fully, and he earned it by showing he would not back down. Older leaders noticed his temper and his loyalty. He wasn't a strategist yet. He was willpower with a short fuse. That combination sparked both opportunity and trouble. The boss, who eventually rose to the top in the late 1950 seconds, preferred quiet business, avoided messy displays, kept violence off the front page. The older man valued calm brokers. The small, fierce up-and-comer had a different style. Instead of trying to change him, the leadership moved him out of the center. He was pushed toward Atlantic City, then a seasonal resort with a long tradition of backroom deals. He was told to make money, keep his head down, and let the big decisions remain in Philadelphia. He learned that shore town quickly. Rooms buzzed with card games. Tourists walked past storefronts without seeing the real work happening upstairs or around the corner. In those years, long before casinos were legalized, he helped collect on debts, monitored bookmakers, and pressured anyone who tried to cut in without permission. He understood the way fear could serve as a business tool, and he used it often. That approach brought results and friction. In the early 1960 seconds, he stabbed a man during an argument, a case that ended with a manslaughter conviction. He went to prison. Losing more than time, he lost a chance to prove he could be trusted to temper himself. When he came home, he wore that prison stretch like a badge among some, but it also fed the older boss's sense that the younger man needed distance. Atlantic City, then, would remain his base. Prison hadn't softened him. It taught him patience. He focused on small percentages taken from card rooms and dice tables. He worked union angles, learned which foreman could be nudged, which steward could be replaced, which contractor couldn't afford a labor problem. Along the coast, hustle and hospitality lived side by side, and he found a way to tax both. The boss in Philadelphia kept the peace by giving him leeway without giving him the spotlight. Then the calendar turned. Casino gambling became legal in New Jersey in the late 1970 seconds, and Atlantic City shifted from a worn resort to a construction site that never seemed to sleep. The skyline rose. Money poured in. Permits, cement, trucking, food service, uniforms, slot machines, security. Every purchase presented a chance for a slice. He saw the opening right away. In that boom, his crew insisted on say-so in concrete contracts called the club by people who later described it in court. The idea was simple. If you wanted to pour a foundation, you took part in a closed circle of approved companies that paid to belong. He pressed contractors for payments, shaped bids, steered deliveries, and turned the city's building rush into a cash stream that flowed directly to him and the organization. He also looked toward a hotel and restaurant workers union that represented thousands of employees across the new casinos. Installing friendly officials there would mean leverage over picket lines, hours, and costs, leverage that could be traded for steady money. That was the plan, and for a time it worked. He had success, but he still carried a chip on his shoulder, and it kept him from ever feeling secure. Everything changed in March 1980, when the long-serving boss in Philadelphia was killed while sitting in his car. His quiet style had held the city stable for decades. With him gone, the careful balance disappeared. It wasn't a public uprising. It was an inside job, a move that drew punishment from beyond Philadelphia's borders. The people who ordered it faced swift consequences. The commission, the informal national board that mediated disputes, didn't bless what had happened, and those who had tried to take power immediately paid a heavy price. Locally, the vacuum lingered. A new leader stepped in, a man who had stood close to the old boss and tried to carry on. Within a year, he was killed by an explosive device outside his home. The city's underworld rattled. Loyalty felt like a word with no weight. Men counted old feuds and new chances. Lines shifted again. In that turmoil, the small man from Atlantic City saw an opening. He had built a money engine at the shore, had a crew with muscle, and had a reputation for acting decisively. He traveled, sought approval, asked for recognition to run the family. He brought forward the case that he could restore order through firm control. Whether the commission loved his candidacy or simply looked for any workable solution, he gained acknowledgement. Back home, he named trusted allies to key positions. An older friend who had guided him sat close, while a fiery South Philadelphia figure became his underboss. His nephew, a bright young man who wore confidence like a perfect suit, rose quickly too. With the seats filled around him, the new chief demanded tribute from every corner: gambling, loans, construction, and unions. Nobody would earn without sharing. That was the rule. Revenue rose. So did resentment. A seasoned capo refused to bend, arguing that loyalty had to be earned, not forced with threats. The older capo had his own followers, his own sense of history, and he wouldn't salute the new order. The dispute turned into a war. It was a citywide contest with ambushes, plots, and payback, none of it detailed here for the sake of decency, and because the public record already makes clear the cost. People aligned with both sides were attacked. Families lived in dread. Businesses shut early. Detectives kept late hours, plotting lines between names and faces. The new boss pushed harder, convinced that fear would settle the matter. He sent messages in ways that didn't leave fingerprints but left no doubt. By the mid-1980 seconds, his faction had the upper hand. The stubborn capo received a life sentence after a key killing brought the law crashing down, and his resistance finally crumbled inside prison walls. With that war quieted, the boss's authority looked absolute. He leaned into the Atlantic City rackets that had made him rich. The contract, club, union infiltration, and protection taxes on just about any enterprise that drew cash in busy neighborhoods. The leadership gathered at restaurants, in back rooms, and in shore apartments to count shares and settle debates. Federal agents, who had spent years studying him, pushed wiretaps, flipped witnesses, and watched patterns unfold. Prosecutors sharpened a tool designed for criminal organizations, the racketeering law that allowed them to pull many threads into one case. While those cases matured, the man at the top tightened his circle. He liked short chains of command and swift action. He rewarded fast results and punished hesitation. That style bred paranoia, and eventually, risk he didn't need. Choosing fear over trust created a culture where no one felt safe. A culture that pushed capable men to consider cooperation with authorities when they faced long sentences. Even as he stood taller than ever in his world, the strain began to show. He reorganized crews, shuffled responsibilities, tested loyalty with sudden demands. He issued orders that shocked even veterans, decisions that targeted men once considered pillars. Among them was the son of the boss killed by the bomb, a proud, competent earner who had shown promise. The new boss gave the green light to remove him after deciding the younger man's independence could threaten the throne. The move sent a chill through every corner. If someone like that could be struck, then nobody had immunity. Witnesses later detailed how fear became the daily weather in the organization. How debates ended with a nod that didn't invite second thoughts. The money still came in, but it now carried whispers. The shore continued to grow. Hotels filled with conventions, slot floors hummed, tables clicked, and crews kept skimming. Contractors paid to avoid delays. Union officers took calls from both legitimate executives and people who asked what would happen if a loading dock slowed to a crawl. Meanwhile, federal cases thickened. By the mid-1980s, the organization's leaders faced indictments tied to racketeering, extortion, and murder conspiracies. The Atlantic City Union case became a landmark, showing in court how outside forces had guided elections and contracts. The construction scheme drew attention from state and federal authorities alike, who began mapping shell companies, straw bidders, and forced partnerships. The man who had once been exiled to the shore now starred in courtroom charts and news graphics that traced his reach. He didn't blink in public. He projected certainty, boasted lightly, and kept to his routines. He had survived the Bruno era, the Testa turmoil, and the Ricobene War. He believed he would survive this too. Yet grand juries don't care about swagger. Witnesses, including men from his inner ring, began to cooperate under the weight of high sentences and the sheer fatigue that comes from living under constant threat. Wiretaps preserved moments he thought were private. Receipts and ledgers that would have been shredded in earlier years now sat in evidence boxes, part of a modern investigative approach that valued patient accumulation over quick raids. The gap between his confidence and his risk widened, week by week. He had always wanted control. That was the great theme of his life, wresting control back from a world that had made him feel small. He achieved it for a time. People jumped when he spoke. Money arrived without delay. Enemies fell silent. Yet the same intensity that built his empire pulled it apart. He treated colleagues like pawns, offended allies, and created a pressure cooker that pushed defendants into witness chairs. By the late 1980s, trials began landing like heavy doors, closing one after another. Juries heard about the Atlantic City Construction Club, the union corruption, the loans with suffocating interest rates, the gambling territories, the internal bloodletting ordered to enforce submission. They heard names linked to specific acts. They read transcripts. They saw the structure and diagrams that looked more like charts from a business school than scenes from a film. The boardwalk breeze never stopped. It curled around hotel corners and slipped into side streets where the old ways had once ruled every step. The man who had stood at the center of it all kept walking into courtrooms, flanked by marshals, chin up, eyes set. He wasn't the kid on a South Philadelphia stoop anymore. He wasn't the brash enforcer in a shoretown clubroom. He was the answer to a question that had haunted the city for decades. What happens when the hunger for respect confuses fear for loyalty? When a leader believes he can rule by decree in a place where patience and alliances had once kept disaster at bay? In the next motions and verdicts, that question would find a lesson. Courtrooms became the new stage. Reporters filled benches, jurors held notebooks, and agents who had spent years in surveillance rooms watched their work turn into exhibits. The law that tied everything together had been on the books since the 1972nd, but in the mid-1980s it matured into a sharp blade. It didn't chase one bet or one threat. It looked at patterns: extortion here, a fixed union vote there, a loan that doubled and redoubled, until a business snapped and called that pattern an enterprise. Prosecutors said the enterprise centered on the man who had taken power after the bomb in the street war, the former Atlantic City enforcer, who now sat at the head of every table. Indictments traced his reach from card rooms to construction sites. He'd once been told to lie low at the shore. Now the shore's boom had made him the most forceful figure in the region. Atlantic City's transformation had enlarged his footprint. Resorts opened first, then more casinos stacked along the inlet, each needing concrete, steel, glass, and endless deliveries. In that building frenzy, he and his allies insisted on control over who poured foundations. Witnesses later called it a club, a closed circle of companies that wrote checks to belong. The cost showed up in padded bids and contracts steered to friends. If a builder balked, trucks idled, or inspectors found reasons to pause. The push wasn't random anger. It was policy. Every pour meant a share. Every share reinforced the authority of the man who had demanded total tribute when he took the chair in Philadelphia. He turned a local tradition of under-the-table dealing into an organized schedule of payments that didn't stop when ribbon cuttings ended. Once the hotels stood, maintenance, renovations, and expansions kept the stream alive. He also reached into the hospitality union that represented the cooks, servers, housekeepers, and bartenders powering those shiny floors. According to court records, trusted associates helped influence leadership elections in the local and guided key appointments. A compliant slate could blunt strikes, soften discipline for favored workers, and open a path for contractors tied to his circle. The union's official mission didn't change, but decision-making bent toward outside interests. When agents finally laid out what they believed had happened, a judge approved a trusteeship. The union would be run under court supervision for a time, its books opened, its elections rerun without interference. It was a public, lasting rebuke of the reach the new boss had achieved during the casino rush. Philadelphia, meanwhile, lived through the consequences of his rise. The Ricobene faction had refused to accept him, and the city spent years navigating the aftershocks. It wasn't a single gunfight. It was a string of ambushes, betrayals, and standoffs that kept entire neighborhoods on edge. A longtime counselor in the organization, a man known for tact, lost his life during that struggle, a death that hardened lines and deepened the feud. Detectives stayed patient, built cases, and eventually brought the older rival into court for murder. He received a life sentence, removing a major source of resistance. But the win carried a cost. Agents had become fluent in names, routines, and meeting places. Files thickened. The same habits that brought victory on the street exposed the group to legal defeat in federal buildings downtown. After winning that war, the boss might have eased up. Instead, he shrank his circle and sharpened his demands. The starkest example involved a young earner with a famous last name, respected for discipline and results, the son of the man killed by the device years earlier. He was supposed to be the future, careful, measured, a likely pillar for decades. The boss saw a threat in that promise. Whether jealousy, paranoia, or a need to prove dominance pushed him, he signed off on removing the young man. The move startled veterans. It broke with the idea that performance and pedigree could still offer some cover. Fear spread. If that figure could fall, no one could rely on past service or the respect of others to stay safe. Prosecutors later said that decision, and several others like it, seeded the cooperation that followed. Cooperation came from men who had sat near the top. A fast-talking collector who had moved between the shore and the city agreed to wear a wire. Another, a veteran lieutenant present at countless meetings, chose to tell investigators what he knew in exchange for a chance to see daylight again. They weren't the only ones. Each defection pulled open another door, revealing the mechanics behind loans that trapped shop owners, betting lines that paid tribute into a central pot, and envelopes passed under tables in exchange for winning bids. With recordings and insiders' notes in hand, the government filed a sweeping racketeering case that stacked years of conduct into one narrative. It didn't matter that individual crimes had different dates and victims. The theme united them, an organization run through fear and financed through coercion. The trial that followed drew the city's full attention. Jurors heard about the construction club and union interference, about bookmaking operations, about interest rates that no bank could advertise, and about orders to eliminate potential rivals and problem earners. They saw transcripts from wiretaps, where coded language didn't hide intent. They watched men who had once saluted the boss point him out across the courtroom. Defense lawyers argued that the cooperators were spinning tales to save themselves, that the meetings were harmless meals or social calls. The jury didn't buy it. In late 1988, verdicts landed: racketeering, extortion, illegal gambling, and murder-related counts. The boss received decades in federal prison, a term so long that it functioned like a life sentence on its own. His nephew, who had served as underboss, also took a heavy term. More cases followed, some rooted in earlier acts. One involved a bookmaker killed in South Philadelphia in the mid-1000s, 980 seconds after resisting demands. Another involved a businessman targeted for not paying the street tax. Witnesses described planning sessions, car switches, and the pressure brought to bear on stubborn targets. Appeals chipped at a few counts here and there, but the overall picture held. By 1989, the group's leadership had been hollowed out by convictions. Federal and state prosecutors had coordinated in a way that kept pressure steady. moving from one trial to the next, so that a setback in one courtroom didn't stall momentum. The message to the city was clear. The long-standing grip on certain corners of commerce had been broken by law, not by a rival. Inside prison, the boss didn't give up control easily. He sent messages through visits and letters, pointing to loyalists as acting leaders. A quiet, older figure was tapped to manage day-to-day affairs, charged with keeping tribute flowing and rules intact. But outside, the ground had shifted. Men who had once feared the boss now worried more about wiretaps and informants. Others saw opportunity in the vacuum and moved toward the center. The attempt to maintain a monolithic structure from behind bars collided with reality. A family fractured by cases cannot be run by will alone. Money shrank. Crews splintered. Influence in unions eroded under oversight. New guys, impatient and hungry, began forming their own alliances that didn't include prisoners' names on the top line. The personal toll reached even deeper. One of his sons suffered a devastating crisis that left lasting injuries, a tragedy commentators described as a consequence of the pressure and attention surrounding the family. Another son, seeking his own place, formally joined the life, a choice that drew headlines when masked men opened fire on him in a South Philadelphia restaurant on a fall night. He survived, but the attack signaled that the father's era was truly over. Shooting at the boss's child, even with the boss already caged, marked a line crossed and a new map drawn. Old allegiances meant less than the urgent scramble for position in a city looking for its next order. The son recovered and later moved in different circles beyond Philadelphia, a path that would bring its own kind of notoriety years down the line. Meanwhile, the institutions he had treated, like tributaries, builders, unions, vendors, adapted to life without him. Contractors learned to file complaints instead of dropping envelopes. Casino companies created compliance offices with the power to stop contracts that smelled wrong. The hospitality union that had been placed under supervision rebuilt its governance, held transparent elections, and answered to monitors who demanded real independence. Those reforms didn't erase every problem, but they cut off the easy routes that had once fed the organization. For residents, the visible effect was subtle. Fewer whispers about who controlled which lot, fewer late-night meetings at back tables, and less fear about a dispute turning into a permanent injury. From confinement, he tried to project the same certainty he had on the outside. He kept routines, maintained a short list of trusted visitors, and insisted that he would outlast his enemies. But prisons build new realities. Younger inmates didn't care about a reputation forged in South Philadelphia clubs. Guards rotated, wardens moved, rules were rules. He filed appeals, challenged convictions, and celebrated modest wins when a particular count fell away, yet the major sentences stayed in place. The nephew who had walked beside him chose cooperation, met with agents, and provided testimony that prosecutors used not just in Philadelphia, but in cases across the map. That defection cut deepest. The man he had raised within the life now described it to juries in plain language. It turned legend into transcript. Looking back at those years, the pattern stands out. He started small, built power in Atlantic City's shadow economy, pushed into unions and construction, and then tried to rule a volatile city by fear. Each step forward carried seeds of the next setback. Violence settled disputes in the moment, but created witnesses, personal grudges, and long memories. Demanding tribute from every corner brought cash, but taught dozens of people the details of the operation. When the era of wiretaps, flipped insiders, and enterprise prosecutions arrived, those details turned into exhibits and testimony. The convictions that followed were not accidents. They were the logical end of a style that believed pressure could replace partnership indefinitely. Still, the story isn't just about trials and titles. It's about the way ambition, if left unchecked by any sense of proportion, narrows a man's circle until only fear remains. In his push to be untouchable, he erased the goodwill that might have saved him when the storm came. He alienated seasoned hands, turned promising juniors into targets, and put his own family in a kind of permanent spotlight that no parent would choose. He had wanted to be remembered as the one who held the city in his palm. The records say he'll be remembered for the opposite, as the example that finally taught a region how to dismantle a long-standing system without celebrating it, without turning it into spectacle, simply by keeping the focus on victims, on the books, and on the steady application of law. By the close of the 1,980 seconds, he was no longer a man about town. He was a federal inmate moving between hearings, waiting on appeals, and watching as former allies adjusted to a Philadelphia he couldn't shape anymore. The shore kept buzzing. The boardwalk lights still blinked through salt mist. But the quiet nods in corner cafes no longer carried the same weight. And the men who once waited on his word took calls from lawyers and compliance officers instead. What happens next stretches beyond one city, pulling in new states, new schemes, and a reminder that when a man refuses to let go even from behind a fence, the consequences can ripple for decades. The last verdicts of the 1,980 seconds left him waking to head counts and call-outs instead of sea breeze and neon. Concrete walls replaced corner booths, and orders, if he gave them at all, traveled by letter, visit, or a phrase tucked into small talk. He had always equated command with certainty. Prison tested that belief. He designated caretakers, pointed to loyalists he trusted to collect debts, manage bookmakers, and keep the old percentages moving. On paper, the structure still existed. Crews, lieutenants, a man to tally the envelopes. In practice, the ground outside shifted every week. Agents hadn't stopped with his conviction. They kept flipping defendants, writing affidavits, and moving on union reforms and construction oversight. Business people, who once handled disputes in back rooms, now called investigators. The climate that had rewarded his bravado was gone. In South Philadelphia, the absence of a visible chief created a space that others rushed to fill. A veteran from the quiet Bruno years tried to impose calm and claim the chair with support from outside arbiters. He wanted to negotiate, to hold meetings without whispers of ambush, to move the city back to the hush of earlier decades. That effort collided with a younger crowd that had no memory of Bruno's long peace and no patience for distant orders handed down from a cell. They had friends from schoolyards and clubs, not from old tables. The older caretakers team and the younger challengers talked past one another, and the city slid toward another crisis. The new storm would not carry his name as the instigator, but it grew from the culture he had cemented. Tribute first. Intimidation as a business model. Status measured by how quickly orders were obeyed. Before that conflict peaked, a ghost of his power surfaced in a way that sickened even hard cases. His nephew's cooperation had broken hearts in his crew and rewired entire cases. He had ushered the young man through rituals, trusted him with strategy and secrets, and watched him learn how to balance conversation and pressure. Now that same voice filled courtrooms with plain descriptions of office holders, gamblers, contracts, and codes. The nephew didn't dress up the past. He named names, explained roles, and showed how his uncle had turned Atlantic City's boom into a revenue machine. Investigators took those accounts and used them to draw lines that stretched from kitchen tables in South Philadelphia to union halls by the boardwalk. The testimony hurt more than any rival's plot because it collapsed a myth that fear could secure forever loyalty. The cooperators kept coming: drivers, collectors, a fixer who knew which foreman would bend. None of them felt safe in a world where doing everything right didn't guarantee tomorrow. The most human blow landed inside his own home. A teenage son, isolated by the notoriety that wrapped around the family, attempted to take his own life and survived with catastrophic injuries. The boy's collapse happened in 1988, in the middle of the trials and headlines, and the consequences lasted for decades. Reporters wrote about it with unusual restraint, and even rivals stopped to acknowledge the weight of that sorrow. People in the neighborhood still talk about it when they tell younger generations what fame in that world really buys. It buys fear, confusion, and a kind of attention that harms kids who never asked for it. For the father, already sealed off behind fences, that tragedy cut deeper than any sentence. Another son chose a different route. He leaned into the life, certain he could walk the line his father had claimed, and find honor where others found risk. On an autumn night, during a crowded dinner in a South Philadelphia restaurant, gunmen in masks burst through the door and opened fire. The tables flipped, plates shattered, and panic swept the room. He was hit but survived, a survival that became city lore. No single mastermind was convicted for that ambush, but it announced a new order. The father's name no longer frightened everyone. With the top man locked away, Rival factions felt bold enough to strike at his family in public. It was a message to him, to his supporters, and to anyone who thought the old hierarchy still had force. On the street, the early 1990 seconds turned into a struggle between the caretaker tied to the Bruno past and a brash South Philadelphia crew that spoke the slang of a new era. The fights were planned in public, an echo of what Philadelphia had endured less than a decade earlier. While he didn't write the scripts for those clashes, his decade of hard rule set the stage. He had taught an entire generation that authority came from fear, not consensus. With him gone, younger men tried to copy his tone without his financial discipline, and the result was chaos that drew even more attention from law enforcement. Surveillance vans hummed outside cafes. Grand juries sat for months. Prosecutors didn't need to prove every punch. They needed the pattern. They had learned how to show patterns from the cases they built against him. From his cell, he still tried to guide outcomes. He sent steadier hands to collect from bookmakers and to call in debts from loan clients. Those hands found that the tide had turned. Restaurant owners who once tried to settle disputes quietly now sat across from agents and signed statements. If a collector spoke in parables about what might happen if money didn't arrive on time, a recorder in a pocket captured the cadence and the threat. The hotel workers' union he had once influenced held supervised elections and published meeting minutes. Trustees opened the books and brought in outsiders with clean reputations to manage finances. Contractors who had paid to pour cement on casino jobs met with auditors and described the old club model with disarming candor. The old ways, laid bare in testimony and transcripts from his trials, were losing their shadows. Even so, additional litigation followed him into the 1990 seconds. Some counts tied to earlier extortion and loan sharking produced more years. Appeals knocked out a conviction here and there, the kind of technical victories that fill legal newsletters, but the main term stood. His racketeering sentence acted like a foundation. New sentences stacked on top rarely changed his earliest release date in any meaningful way. He moved between facilities, learned new rules at each stop, and watched friendships thin as co-defendants accepted deals, entered witness programs, or simply aged out of usefulness. In interviews, agents sometimes called his case a turning point for the region, the moment when the combination of modern surveillance, enterprise statutes, and union oversight broke a hold that had lasted generations. He never publicly conceded that point. He said little in court beyond polite acknowledgments to judges. Through his lawyers, he maintained that cooperators had incentives to invent, that routine meals had been turned into meetings, that business dealings that looked suspicious in hindsight were ordinary at the time. He never pretended to be an altar boy, but he also wouldn't offer the kind of mea culpa that might have softened his legend. He carried himself with the same deliberate posture, the same clipped answers, the same gaze that tried to signal that nothing had changed. The posture fooled nobody. Fences, routine counts, and the slow erosion of influence changed everything. The communities he had taxed started to breathe differently. South Philadelphia, still proud and protective, built new habits. Merchants pooled information and got comfortable calling the authorities. Unions rewrote bylaws to insulate treasuries and elections. Atlantic City's casino companies erected compliance departments with veto power over vendors. Public corruption units at the state and federal levels learned to coordinate, sharing data so that the left hand knew what the right hand was filing. Those changes didn't eliminate all wrongdoing. No city ever gets to zero, but the default mode shifted. A contractor who got a call demanding a consulting fee to ensure cement arrived on time had a different set of options than he had in 1979. That shift is part of his legacy too, even if he would never accept credit for it. Inside, age crept up on him. Old injuries flared. Prison food and medical care, never luxurious, were now constant topics of conversation. He filed and refiled, asked for hearings, and adjusted to rulings that chipped but didn't topple. He read, walked the yard, kept his circles small, and measured time and holidays that came and went without family. He watched the next wave of Philadelphia leaders tussle, watched a new set of names rise from taverns, gyms, and rented apartments. Watched yet another slate of trials end with heavy terms. The city, in other words, kept moving without him. Every year that passed made it harder to argue that he sat at the center of anything except his own memory of power. Journalists wrote books and long features about the Philadelphia story. They dug into archives, compared court transcripts, and interviewed retired detectives who still kept boxes of notes in basements. A consistent picture emerged. His tenure had been the most volatile in modern memory, the period when public violence, extreme demands, and relentless internal policing of perceived disloyalty took the family from a revenue engine to a factory of informants. The writers didn't treat him like a larger-than-life rebel. They treated him as a case study in overreach. The courtroom evidence supported that view. The construction club that skimmed off concrete jobs, the exploitation of a hospitality union's elections and contracts, the betting operations that kicked up percentages, the loans that doubled and doubled again until shops closed their doors. Juries heard it all. That is why his sentences lasted as long as they did. He held one last thing closely: the belief that fear, applied consistently, could quiet any room. Even behind a fence, he tried to set that tone, dismissing rivals, deriding cooperators, and directing subordinates to keep collecting. But fear without proximity fades. A collector can mention a name with awe only so many times before a business owner realizes that the person behind the name will not walk through the door. Distance weakens myths. The men who had once flinched at a sideways glance aged, retired, or died. Newcomers didn't read the old cues. They checked caller IDs, saved voicemails, and met with investigators who arrived with thick binders and a firm grip on enterprise law. As the decade closed, the shape of his life was set. He sat on the far side of a long term, his appeals exhausted, his children living with the consequences of his choices, his city remade by cases that had turned his methods into cautionary tales. He hadn't been a phantom, a rumor, or a movie character. He had been a real boss who demanded tribute from gamblers, contractors, and union officers, who ordered violence to protect position and revenue, who treated a booming seaside town like a private cash line, and who believed that intimidation could substitute for trust. The record indictments, verdicts, union trusteeships, compliance reforms has preserved that, not as gossip, but as a public ledger of cause and effect. The years after that brought more distance, more gray in his hair, and a city that taught itself to remember without romanticizing. Families that lost loved ones to the life found voices in courtrooms and city halls. Young workers in hotels and restaurants voted in clean union elections and learned to file grievances using bylaws instead of backstage favorites. Builders dealing in steel and cement sent bids to email addresses run by compliance officers trained to spot shell companies and forced partnerships. All those details, mundane, bureaucratic, modern, were victories built on lessons from his rule. The man who had measured success by the speed of obedience left behind a civic transition measured in audits, minutes, and training sessions. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. And it worked. He still had years to live, years that would see health scares, more transfers, and the gnawing awareness that the younger men telling war stories on city corners no longer put him at the center of their tales. They knew the broad strokes. They knew he had run Philadelphia in the 1,980 seconds, ordered people removed, bent unions, and squeezed construction. They knew that agents had boxed him in using a law that treated patterns as proof. Beyond that, he was a page in a binder. His own words about loyalty and respect didn't survive outside the memory of a shrinking circle. In that gap between how he wanted to be remembered and how the public record remembers him sits the clearest measure of what his choices actually bought. By the mid-1,990 seconds, he measured mornings by a guard's footsteps and the clank of keys. Schedules replaced spontaneity. The man who once chose the restaurant, the route, and the hour now waited for call-outs and counted pages in appellate briefs. Messages slipped out through, approved visitors, short letters, or a few words tucked into small talk that sounded harmless to anyone not attuned to the code. He still appointed caretakers, still named men to collect from bookmakers, still wanted a share from loans and old arrangements. But the air outside had changed. Business owners who once settled quietly now met with investigators. Unions ran elections with monitors seated up front. Compliance officers at casinos and contractors checked vendors against lists and asked for tax IDs instead of envelopes. Habits he had forged had been studied, documented, and fenced off. Philadelphia itself wrestled with succession while he watched from behind glass. A careful organizer from the Bruno era tried to manage the city with diplomacy, but a younger South Philadelphia crew answered that approach with swagger and defiance. Meetings that used to be whispered turned into street theater. Surveillance vans rolled as regularly as delivery trucks. The new conflict wasn't one he directed, but it unfolded on a stage he had built, a place where tribute was expected and where an order carried weight because people feared the consequences of ignoring it. Now, with him gone from the sidewalks, men who had grown up under that model mimicked the posture without the discipline that kept side businesses profitable and quiet. The result was chaos that drew cameras, headlines, and another round of indictments. He kept trying to steer. He pointed to older hands he believed could maintain receipts and resist the bait of flashy disputes. Those men found the world less receptive. A collector hinting that late payments would cause trouble now spoke into a pocket recorder. A bookmaker once resigned to paying a percentage now called a lawyer. A contractor who in 1979 might have joined a club to pour cement declined and filed a complaint with a casino compliance office instead. Courtrooms had turned the club into a public phrase, and nobody wanted to be the subject of a sequel. The hospitality local he had once influenced met under temporary trustees, then new leaders, then bylaws revised in plain view. The very routine he prized, fixed votes, chosen stewards, friendly business agents, had been put under a bright light. That light didn't fade. Even so, his name kept reappearing on dockets. After the sweeping racketeering verdicts of 1,988 and the murder count that followed, prosecutors returned with additional cases tied to older schemes: more extortion, more illegal gambling, more pressure on shop owners and contractors. Each time, defense lawyers argued that cooperators padded stories to save themselves. Each time, juries weighed transcripts, bank records, and a pattern that didn't require anyone to be a poet to understand. Appeals trimmed here and there on technical points, but the big numbers stayed. His aggregate time kept him planted inside for a span that would outlive many of his peers. Loss threaded through those years. The incident that left one son catastrophically injured cast a long shadow. You won't find gruesome detail here. It is enough to say the damage was permanent and devastating. Another son chased standing in the life and caught bullets at a restaurant. An attack that proved the father's name no longer guaranteed safety. He survived, then took a path that would move him beyond Philadelphia and into circles with new allies, and years later, a different kind of prosecution. For a parent, those outcomes carved deeper wounds than any sentence. The costs of his choices reached into rooms he could no longer enter, shaping days he could only hear about in visits and letters. Writers and former agents began to analyze his rule with a cool eye. They described the Atlantic City period, when he and close allies turned legalized casino construction into a steady tax on concrete, trucking, and vendors. They detailed the way union influence had helped smooth contracts and silence trouble. They mapped loan operations that trapped small businesses with rates that guaranteed default. They drew careful lines through the Ricabene War, showing how a feud that started as a political dispute turned into a campaign that paralyzed neighborhoods. They did not glorify any of it. They framed it as a civic problem that required long patience, better tools, and partnerships between federal and state offices. Those tools, wiretaps, flipped insiders, enterprise prosecutions, had matured on his watch and then defined his fall. He did not break in public. He kept the same clipped posture in court, the same refusal to admit more than what the record already made clear. Through counsel, he said cooperators exaggerated, that social meals were being recast as strategy sessions, that hostile witnesses were chasing bargains. He rarely raised his voice and almost never took bait. He had once built a reputation as a man who wouldn't bend. Now that refusal kept him locked in a narrative that ignored the mountain of sworn testimony that had grown around his name. Pride can be a quiet cell too. Inside, he adapted to a different economy. There were no restaurants to hold court in, no night drives to check on a job site. There were routine counts, commissary limits, and the slow march of institutional time. Transfers brought new wardens and rules. Health crept in as a factor that no amount of will could overrule, he read. He walked the yard. He kept a short list of visitors and told them the same thing. Stay loyal. Keep the old ways alive. Bring the envelopes to the right place. But the outside map wouldn't stay still. The old guard aged or died. Younger faces cared more about phone records than about who once controlled the boardwalk. Fear without proximity loses voltage. When a name becomes a story instead of a presence, business adjusts. Philadelphia's calendar didn't pause for him. The caretaker from the Bruno years ended up in a courtroom, and then in a cell. The younger crew leader landed in headlines, and then in his own series of trials. Other names stepped forward, some quiet, some loud, and the city cycled through another set of negotiations, upheavals, and reform efforts. By then, all of it played out with a new baseline of surveillance. The commission that had once blessed or blocked successions in whispers was a diminished echo. The authority that mattered lived in offices with badges on the wall and press conferences on the schedule. That shift, too, linked back to his era. The scale of his reach had forced prosecutors and regulators to modernize, to build cases that united union oversight with fraud analysis and old-fashioned street investigation. In those same years, a thinner thread tied him to something far from row house blocks and casino towers. A publicly traded Texas mortgage company began to wobble after the subprime rush. Board seats became valuable. Shell entities moved money between accounts. Invoices labeled consulting and advisory piled up. And behind those invoices sat names linked to his family and their associates. From a cell, he participated in a scheme that treated a struggling finance firm like a target for a raid, not with ski masks or late-night break-ins, but with board votes, acquisitions, and contracts that bled cash to insiders. It was a new kind of racket, modernized to suit the era, suits and filings instead of muscle on a loading dock. He received tribute through indirect channels, rent, recurring fees, and gifts labeled as services. Investigators followed the paper, then followed the calls, then followed the habit of treating any revenue stream as tax. That case took years to ripen. Agents mapped entities, analyzed servers, and sat down with accountants who could explain how ordinary businesses can be hollowed out by friendly directors. They compared notes with field offices far from Philadelphia. When the indictments landed, they carried a familiar theme, an enterprise run through intimidation, now aimed not at corner bars and contractors, but at a public company beholden to shareholders. He was already deep into his federal time when those charges hit. Still, he fought them too, through counsel, insisting that the distance between a prison and a boardroom made the accusations more theater than fact. Juries disagreed. A judge added more years, enough to guarantee he would spend the rest of his life in custody. It's important to linger on a paradox. He always wanted to be seen as strong, decisive, unwilling to compromise. That image carried him from South Philadelphia to the head of a table many had longed to sit at. Yet the same image made him brittle. When the tide of law and public attention rose, he had no give. Men who might have backed him through a transition to quieter profits instead fled, flipped, or built their own networks. A leader who insists on fear for fear's sake often forgets that fear creates flight. It makes people run toward anyone who promises relief. In his story, that meant witnesses, tapes, and a stack of exhibits taller than any man at counsel table. He outlived many from his own generation. Transfers moved him through high-security blocks and medical units. The last settings felt more like clinics than prisons, places where age softened the edges of old rivalries. He watched as a nephew's memoir turned the closed world he had protected into chapters that students and retirees could buy at a bookstore. He watched as journalists revisited the Bruno years and contrasted that long, quiet order with the rapid, brutal pace of his time on top. He heard about nephews and cousins of old friends becoming chefs and nurses instead of collectors and lookouts. The city kept going, and so did he. One count at a time, one holiday visit at a time, one slow walk in a yard ringed by fences and floodlights. What he left behind beyond those fences was a record that doesn't need embellishing. A manslaughter conviction early in his life signaled a temper that would shape everything that followed. Years as an enforcer at the shore taught him the value of leverage. The casino boom gave him a way to tax construction and sway unions. The murders ordered to enforce his will made famous in testimony. Not in any glamorized retelling shocked even men used to living hard. The Rickabine feud ripped stability apart. The racketeering verdicts of 1,988 and the related convictions that trailed them in 1989 and after closed the door on his version of leadership. While confined, he kept trying to impose himself on a city that had learned to live without him. Then came the finance company case, a lady career pivot that proved geography didn't stop him from trying to turn any flow of money into a tribute line. Every part of that narrative shows cause and effect. Push people long enough, and they either submit or they talk. Stamp out dissent among your own, and you end up surrounded by silence that isn't loyalty. It's fear, and fear is brittle. Treat unions, contractors, and small businesses as tributaries to your table. And those institutions will eventually harden against you because the public won't accept it forever. The boardwalk still hums, and South Philadelphia still cooks on Sundays. But the old signals who nodded at whom, which table mattered, which corner carried weight mean less with each year that passes. The city learned that lesson the hard way. So did he. In the end, the picture is clear without melodrama. A boy from Brooklyn moved to a tight Philadelphia block, learned which men gave orders, and spent a lifetime trying to become one of them. He did it for a time, by turning fear into policy. The courts answered with another policy. Prove the pattern, show the people, follow the money, and trust jurors to see what they see. His later years, gray hair, medical units, new cases about a mortgage lender he never stepped inside, are the last proof that he never stopped pushing for control. The push finally met a system that had learned how to push back. He grew older behind fences, while the city he once bent to his will adjusted to mornings without him. Letters out, letters in, visits that ended too fast, and a calendar filled with deadlines that only lawyers could love replaced the rhythm of corner cafes and late drives along the shore. He never stopped trying to project command. In his mind, a directive remained a directive, whether spoken in a restaurant or delivered by a carefully phrased sentence during a monitored call. Yet the outside world kept building new habits that did not include him. Business owners learned to document pressure instead of bowing to it. Union locals held open meetings. Casinos and contractors hired compliance staff who spoke the language of audits and vendor vetting. What he had once run as a set of private arrangements had become a case study for how institutions should defend themselves. To understand the pull he once had, you have to return to his prime and the way he organized revenue. It was never just about gambling dens or a single union hall. He believed in layering. A bookmaker might kick up a percentage. A loan offered at a rate that squeezed a struggling shop would generate monthly payments that never ended. A contractor who wanted to avoid delays at job sites would pay for peace by joining a closed circle of approved firms that all knew the real price of membership. Union influence smoothed labor flare-ups, and that influence was bought with help during elections, get-out operations that turned on quiet promises and unspoken expectations. None of it was new to American cities, but he pushed it with an intensity that left little room for friendship or slack. The machine ran hot. During the casino boom, he added a layer that proved especially profitable: the gatekeeping of construction materials. The story came out later through testimony, financial records, and men who chose cooperation over life sentences. Builders described how bids had to be shaped to include firms tied to the circle, how deliveries moved on time when the right envelopes changed hands, how inspectors suddenly discovered reasons to pause when someone tried to work outside the arrangement. That network helped him fund a war at home and purchase status in the larger underworld. It also created witnesses in hard hats in offices who could, when pressed, tell investigators how the deals worked in plain language that jurors understood. He cultivated a small inner ring. A seasoned neighborhood figure became the public face in South Philadelphia, handling introductions and relaying orders. His nephew grew into the role of underboss, with speed that surprised older men. Trusted hands watched unions, card games, and loan ledgers. For a while, the system held. Then, the demands escalated. Tribute wasn't only expected, it was required at a level that even veterans grumbled about. The smartest earners, including a disciplined young capo with a famous surname, began to worry about what came next if they kept growing. Jealousy and suspicion met in a single decision, and the capo disappeared from the map. That choice, detailed in multiple courtrooms without unnecessary gore, did not make him safer. It united his detractors, chilled his allies, and taught a lesson to a dozen men who would later sit on witness stands. If achievement could become a reason to be targeted, then there was no safety in doing the job well. The feud with the older capo who spurned his leadership dragged on, costing lives and driving families from stoops into living rooms while detectives drove patterns onto corkboards. His consigliere, a man known for tact, paid with his life, an event that slammed shut any remaining doors to diplomacy. When that rival finally received a life term, the boss at the top felt unassailable. He was wrong. Investigators had watched the feud with cold eyes. They recorded calls, charted meetings, and took note of every cash stream. When they filed the big case in the late 1982, a racketeering indictment that treated scattered crimes as parts of a single enterprise, they used the feud's chaos as proof of method and motive. Juries convicted. He got decades. His nephew got decades. Others followed. From inside, he tried to keep the flow alive. He named caretakers, insisted that the old lines stay in place. He disapproved of public displays by younger men who confused volume with power. He wanted order, fast money, and no headlines. The street didn't cooperate. A veteran linked to the Bruno years tried to rebuild through diplomacy. A brash South Philadelphia faction answered with bravado. The city entered the 1992 with yet another internal fight. Surveillance vans humming as regularly as delivery trucks. He could not halt it. Authority without proximity sounded like nostalgia. The part of his story that reached beyond row houses and casinos shows how adaptable he could be when a new opportunity promised revenue. A public mortgage company in Texas, wobbling after the late 1992's lending rush, attracted the attention of his circle. Associates on the outside amassed board seats, installed friendly executives, and approved a string of deals that moved cash to entities they controlled. Fees labeled consulting, advisory, and acquisition appeared like clockwork. He stayed hundreds of miles away, but prosecutors later showed how messages from prison informed who held the pen. The operation did not rely on street threats. It relied on corporate authority wielded for private gain, a whitey-collar mirror of the tribute model he had enforced in Atlantic City. Shareholders lost. The company collapsed. Years later, a jury in New Jersey convicted his son and the flamboyant dealmaker who had executed the plan. The father took additional time as the man behind the curtain. Health would eventually move him to a medical facility, but the sentence made the point. Geography didn't tame him. Family hurt threaded through that era. One son's catastrophic injury, the result of an act of despair during the height of headlines, changed every holiday and visit. Another son chose the life and paid in blood at a public dinner, surviving by inches. He later relocated, made high-profile friends far from Philadelphia, and faced his own charges unrelated to his father's 1982 reign. The father watched from behind glass and fences, taking in news that would break any parent's heart, powerless to fix any of it. These are the parts of the story that caution anyone tempted to romanticize the old codes. The cost does not stop at the person who signs orders. It travels down the family tree. While he wrestled with appeals, writers and retired agents mapped his years with sober detail. They tracked how Angelo Bruno's quiet discipline had kept Philadelphia's organization profitable but low profile, why Bruno exiled the temperamental upstart to Atlantic City, how that exile became the making of the man once casinos arrived, and how all of it culminated in a rule built on fear. They described the union capture in Atlantic City that ended under court supervision, the concrete schemes that cost developers and raised prices for everyone, the loans that forced small shops to close their doors, and the gambling operations that funneled cash into a central pot. They noted that when he tightened his grip, he produced something he never intended. A cascade of cooperators. There is a straight line from overreach to empty chairs at defense tables. Men who had sat close to him explained those dynamics under oath. A quick-talking collector described meetings at the shore, names, assignments, and the language used to relay demands. A lieutenant who had been present for celebratory dinners and tense strategy sessions walked juries through the way he made promotions, punished hesitation, and demanded tribute. Court reporters put it all into transcripts that ended up in libraries. The nephew's words cut deepest, not because he embroidered, but because he didn't. He laid out the structure and the choices in the flat tone of a man reciting a ledger. He still refused to concede in public. He leaned on the idea that cooperators save themselves by spinning tales, that social meals get misread by people who don't understand neighborhood life, that prosecutors draw lines between dots that never met. He was correct about one thing. Communities are complex, and outsiders often miss context. But recordings, bank trails, and repeated patterns across years have their own gravity. Jurors felt it. So did judges. He won a few appellate skirmishes, The kind of procedural victories that narrow a count or reframe a label. The big numbers stayed. The neighborhoods he once taxed adapted. Bar owners, corner stores, and small contractors learned to work together and talk to authorities early. A generation of union members at the shore experienced elections run under watchful eyes, then under reformed bylaws that made it harder for any one set of hands to hold the treasury. The casino floors kept humming, but compliance offices behind them drew hard lines on vendor access and ownership disclosure. There will always be people who try to work the angles. That is part of city life. What changed, in part because of his era, was how well the institutions recognized those angles. Inside, age did what headlines could not. It slowed him. Medical checkups, medication, and transfers to facilities that could handle chronic conditions took up more space than legal filings. He kept a small circle of visitors and held onto a vision of himself as the man who could still, with a word, make a room quiet. The world beyond the fence viewed him differently, not as a man who might return, but as a case study taught to young agents and compliance officers, learning how to follow money and show patterns. The same young workers who poured coffee in union halls or ran rebar crews on casino jobs in the 1,980 seconds now sent their kids to schools where civics classes explored how communities resist capture. When people in South Philadelphia tell younger listeners about the old days now, they do not gesture to limousines or silk ties. They talk about missed holidays, about neighbors who disappeared, about the way businesses lived with a constant tax that nobody voted for. They talk about a time when fear acted like currency, and how that currency collapsed when enough people realized that speaking to law enforcement together made them stronger than any one name on a rumor mill. They say his rise proved that one person's will can bend a system for a while, and that his fall proved communities can tilt it back. He held fast to the belief that respect and fear were the same thing. That equation powered his ascent and set up his collapse. Men who had respected quiet bosses like Bruno resented the constant demands. Newer men who thought glory came from headlines, and bravado learned how quickly publicity draws prosecutors. The result was a family that went from steady profits to constant trials in less than a decade. The statistics tell their own story. Long racketeering terms for the top tier, waves of guilty pleas from the middle, and a diaspora of soldiers who either left the life, joined new crews, or tried and failed to recreate the old model in a different era. There is no need to raise voices to make the point. A boy from Brooklyn learned how South Philadelphia measured status, marched into Atlantic City with a chip on his shoulder, and turned a seasonal town's legal boom into a private tax base. He fought rivals, punished dissent, and pushed every corner for revenue. Investigators answered with wiretaps, informants, and patient enterprise cases. Juries weighed patterns and believed what they heard. He served decades, set caretakers who couldn't hold, reached into a public company from a prison yard, added time, and grew old while the city moved on. Families counted their losses, unions rebuilt, and the shore kept its lights on without the shadow he once cast. The lesson is simple enough to tell at bedtime without scaring anyone. Power without restraint burns fast. If you rely on fear, you won't build loyalty. You'll build silence that cracks when pressure comes. If you treat a city like a set of tributaries to your table, people will eventually close the taps. He wanted to be remembered as the man who controlled Philadelphia. The record remembers him as the man whose overreach taught Philadelphia how to say no. Seasons turned while he lived by whistles and counts. Calendars in the free world were filled with weddings, school graduations, and new buildings rising along the inlet. His own calendar revolved around legal deadlines, visitor lists, and medical checkups. He kept his bearing, the clipped cadence that had once made subordinates sit up straighter. To him, distance didn't erase rank. A note passed in a visiting room or a phrase spoken on a monitored call still counted as direction. Yet outside, the era that fed his authority had faded. People who once whispered now filed affidavits. Companies that had once relied on friendly intermediaries learned to fill out forms, hire compliance staff, and escalate disputes to regulators without fear. Unions accustomed to backroom favors built procedures that made those favors harder to pull off. The map had redrawn itself. On the streets he left behind, a caretaker with ties to the old quiet order tried to guide things in the early 1,990 seconds. He favored sit-downs over stunts, hoping to restore the hush that Angelo Bruno had enforced for decades. Opposite him stood a younger faction raised in rowhouse bars and gyms, men who had watched the late 1980 seconds and come away believing that flash and bravado broadcast strength. Their feud produced scenes that pulled television cameras to South Philadelphia corners, chases, unmarked sedans, sudden arrests. He didn't plan those clashes, but his legacy tribute demanded. Dissent crushed. Speed valued over subtlety hovered over them. Experience taught investigators not to sprint after each skirmish. They let the pattern develop, drew lines through phone records and meetings, and, as before, turned that pattern into racketeering counts that did not require a jury to decode poetry. He still tried to pick his successors from a distance. He chose a steady figure to oversee daily receipts, a man who had earned a reputation for restraint during the Bruno years. He urged him to keep gambling lines tight, loan books current, and collectors polite but firm. But a leader's presence matters, and presence can't be faked from a prison yard. Collectors who once relied on his name found business owners less compliant. The first no turned into a statement to agents. The second no turned into a subpoena. Meanwhile, the hospitality workers in Atlantic City, the union he had once treated like a lever, operated under reformed bylaws with outside monitors checking the books. Monitors didn't care who had once run the back rooms. They cared about minutes, ballots, and receipts. He had helped create the need for that vigilance. And the vigilance did not retire when he did. Journalists spent those years stitching together a full portrait of his time on top. They tracked the exile to Atlantic City after Bruno judged him too volatile. The slow climb from errand runner to enforcer. The 1,960 seconds manslaughter conviction that removed any doubt about his temper. The casino boom that turned a decaying resort into a bullion mine for anyone who could control concrete, trucking, uniforms, and vending. They traced the way his circle influenced union elections, how dues money and contract talks became a tool for leverage, and how developers learned to join a closed group for access to pours and deliveries. They described the war with Harry Ricobene, the murder of his own consigliere during that war, and the chilling signal sent when he stripped protection from a promising young capo whose only crime was success. None of that reporting needed lurid flourishes. Court transcripts and taped conversations already carried the weight. The nephew's testimony became the spine of many accounts. He had been an eager protege, then the formal underboss, and finally a witness in multiple courtrooms. He offered specific memories, which restaurants hosted which meetings, who handled union contacts, how percentages flowed from bookmakers and loadout docks to envelopes, then to apartments by docks, the shore and houses in South Philadelphia. He explained how ambition and fear tightened the boss's grip over the mid-1980 seconds, and how that tightening forced otherwise loyal earners to consider cooperation once they felt that performance no longer bought safety. The nephew's cooperation unlocked other voices. A wiry collector who had seemed born with a joke on his tongue wore a wire. A trusted lieutenant who had sat at more than one celebratory dinner traded secrets for a shot at daylight. Their accounts fit. Not perfectly human recollection never does, but enough for juries to feel the rhythm of the enterprise. He never offered the kind of apology that sometimes softens a man's image in history books. Through counsel, he continued to say that prosecutors had turned neighborhood life into conspiracy, that meetings were just meals, that witnesses exaggerated to spare themselves decades. He was right that cooperators want deals. He wasn't right that deals alone make a case. Bank ledgers, phone logs, surveillance photos, and the repetition of methods across years gave the government a spine that didn't collapse if one narrator stumbled. Appeals trimmed the edges of certain counts. They didn't budge the core. Time added quieter losses to the public ones. The son who had attempted to end his life during the storm of 1988 lived, but with injuries that changed everything. Houses, holidays, plans. Another son absorbed bullets at a crowded South Philadelphia restaurant a year later and survived. A survival that broadcasters mentioned whenever they explained how the old order had ended. That son later left the neighborhood map and became a figure in an audacious corporate plot, one that would drag the family name into headlines a generation after the boardwalk years. The father saw these events from a distance that no amount of will could bridge. The price of his choices reached far past any envelope or roster of soldiers. That corporate plot deserves a clear, simple telling. A Texas mortgage company traded on a public exchange had been weakened by the Lady 1000 990 seconds lending bubble. In the 2000s, a group tied to his son began acquiring influence over the board. Once in, they pushed the company to buy obscure businesses from entities they themselves controlled, paying above market and funding the deals with the company's own cash. They signed consulting and advisory contracts that guaranteed monthly payments to their circle. The scheme didn't rely on threats made in back rooms. It relied on control of signatures and agendas, a whitey-collar version of the old tribute model. Prosecutors later described how messages from prison kept the father in the loop and ensured that a cut landed in accounts tied to him. Agents followed emails, corporate minutes, wire transfers, and calls. In 2014 and 2015, juries convicted the son and the flamboyant dealmaker who had orchestrated the takeovers. The father, already serving a long federal term, received additional years after being named a behind-of-the-scenes force. Shareholders lost millions. The company collapsed. The method had changed. The core impulse hadn't. By then, Philadelphia had moved on through more cycles. The caretaker linked to the Bruno years went to trial and prison. The younger crew leader served his own time and then tried to recast himself as a man who enjoyed the limelight but preferred restaurants to street corners. New groups with different accents and alliances filled spaces that his organization once considered theirs by tradition. Meanwhile, what used to be whispered now showed up in public records. Contractors described paying consulting fees under the old regime in sworn statements. Union locals filed reports with monitors. Casino companies kept vendor lists that could be audited by regulators, and a mismatch in ownership paperwork could sink a deal faster than a call from any boss ever did. His name, once a hush word in certain rooms, became a lesson plan for compliance officers learning to spot red flags. He aged into a new kind of confinement, the medical wing. Blood pressure cuffs replaced handshakes. Pills replaced espresso. He developed the ailments common to men who have carried stress for decades: heart problems, diabetes, and the wear that comes from routine meals and limited movement. Transfers moved him between secure hospital units where corridors smelled like disinfectant, not marinara. He kept that erect posture as long as he could. He kept the list of visitors short and asked questions in the same clipped way, hungry for details about neighborhoods he hadn't walked in years. In those conversations, he still insisted that loyalty outlasts time, that a nod from the right person can travel farther than a subpoena. The people talking to him often nodded back out of respect for age and history. Outside, the city had no reason to nod. Men who had idolized him in their 20s were grandfathers now, more likely to talk about cholesterol than collections. The nephew published a memoir with a reporter, turning the closed world of the 1,980 seconds into chapters that even high schoolers could digest. Documentaries examined Angelo Bruno's quiet governance, the bomb that ended it, the mad scramble that followed, and the decade of hard edges that defined his reign. Boardwalk lights flickered in Be With You role, while historians, prosecutors, and former detectives explained how a city learned to move from rumor to record. The moral never needed italics. If you run on fear, you can rule fast, but not for long. He seemed to accept none of that publicly. He didn't admit regret on the record, didn't grant long magazine interviews where a former boss tries to explain himself. In that silence, people projected. Some saw iron discipline, a man who stayed within his own code until the last. Others saw obstinacy, a refusal to acknowledge damage done not only to rivals and victims but to his own household. The truth, like most truths in stories like this, likely sat somewhere in between pride, habit, and a belief that acknowledgement equals weakness. The broader city distilled his years into practical changes. Detectives trained the next generation to build enterprise cases that showed jurors the forest, not just trees. Regulators wrote rules that required disclosures about ownership, vendors, and subcontractors. Union locals held elections with independent observers. Cooperation between agencies, federal, state, and local, became standard instead of exceptional. None of that is exciting to watch. It is paperwork, checklists, and meetings. But it's what closes doors that used to be left ajar for men who knew how to walk through them with a smile and a quiet threat. Without the scale of his reach in the 1,980 seconds, those lessons might have been slower to arrive. Sometimes, late in the day in a prison yard, men who remember the old Philadelphia sit on benches and swap stories. They talk about a kid from Brooklyn who moved to South Philadelphia and decided he would not be overlooked. They talk about Atlantic City before and after casinos, about how one person's stubbornness can be an engine and a trap. They say he was the smallest man at the table, with the largest appetite for control, and how that appetite built a fortune and then fed a wrecking ball that swung through his own ranks. They talk about the nephew, about the union that came under trusteeship, about the concrete group that seemed to run half the shore, about a restaurant ambush that announced a new era. They nod at the thought that, in the end, the most durable defeats he suffered came not from rivals with guns but from rules and people willing to enforce them. He had always believed that respect and fear were twins. The city learned to separate them. Respect, it turned out, could be earned by steady work by cops, prosecutors, union reformers, business owners, who refused to panic and instead documented, collaborated, and took one careful step after another. Fear still lives in any big city. It always will. But it can be diluted when enough people refuse to let it run their daily math. His story, real, documented, full of court dates and reforms, sits at the center of that lesson. The boy who watched men in suits command rooms grew into a man who commanded rooms, until the habit of force made his circle so tight that people chose to leave it rather than be crushed by it. From there, the rest followed. Indictments, verdicts, a new kind of scheme in a boardroom instead of a back room, more years added to a term that already stretched past the horizon. By the time this part of the tale winds down, he's an old man navigating medical corridors under fluorescent lights. The shore keeps humming in summer. South Philadelphia still smells like Sunday sauce. Casino towers wink at dusk. But the system he once bent has springs in it now. It rebounds. It remembers. And while his name still holds a certain charge in the neighborhoods where he once walked, the charge powers a warning more than a legend. That warning will carry into the final chapters, through final transfers, last appeals, and the quiet that comes when even the most determined man must admit that the calendar, at last, gets the last word. Age narrowed his world to routines, a guard's nod, a nurse's checklist, a scheduled call that cut off at the same minute every time. He tried to keep command alive with short phrases and clipped questions. Distance didn't feel like a barrier to him. It felt like a challenge to be managed. Orders once traveled by whispers in corner booths. Now they traveled in careful sentences during monitored visits. Outside, the people he once taxed built habits that ran on paperwork, not fear. Union halls posted minutes. Casino compliance teams kept binders on vendors and subcontractors. Contractors filed complaints instead of envelopes. The gray world that had sustained his power rooms where everyone knew the code and nobody wrote anything down shrank. South Philadelphia's streets, which had echoed with his name a decade earlier, formed new rhythms without him. A careful old-school organizer tried to steady things, laying claim to the chair through ties to the Bruno years. Across from him stood a younger set raised on the Lady 1980 seconds tempo, men who saw headlines as proof of presence. Their rivalry unfolded in the open. Stakeouts, sudden arrests, quiet men blasted into notoriety by a camera lens. He wasn't plotting those moves, yet his style tribute as policy, dissent answered fast, set the tone. Investigators, wiser now, didn't chase every incident. They built timelines, traced calls, and stitched a larger picture. When charges came, they were built not on single scenes but on a repeating pattern that jurors recognized from earlier cases bearing his name. He tried to name caretakers from afar. A steady figure with a Bruno-era reputation took on the task of keeping receipts moving and tempers even. The caretaker told bookmakers to keep lines tidy and collectors to keep voices low. It didn't hold. Business owners who once paid out of habit started keeping notes and saving messages. A collector implying trouble now found a recorder picking up every syllable. The hospitality workers local that had once bent under outside influence lived under bylaws rewritten with court oversight. Elections ran under the eye of monitors. The language of motions, ballots, and audits replaced winks and nods. Reporters kept piecing together the full arc of his life, from a Brooklyn birth in 1929 to a South Philadelphia adolescence where he learned who mattered in cafe corners, and to Atlantic City, work that taught leverage as a business model. They recounted the 1,960 seconds manslaughter case that stamped his file with a warning about temperament. They explained how casino legalization turned a faded resort into a money pump, and how he and trusted allies placed themselves at the valve concrete, trucking, uniforms, and vendor contracts. They gave plain descriptions of the club model that guided pours and deliveries, told through testimony, receipts, and men in hard hats who finally sat with agents and explained how it worked. They traced the war with a defiant capo who refused to bow, the murder of his conciliatory advisor during that conflict, and the chilling message sent when a promising young earner with a famous last name was removed despite loyalty and results. The tone of the writing felt clinical, not romantic. The facts didn't need polish. One voice carried special weight. His nephew's. The protege who became underboss and then a witness told jurors how money flowed from betting slips, loading docks, and union treasuries into envelopes and accounts controlled by the circle. He described meetings by the shore and in South Philadelphia dining rooms, who sat where, who spoke, who listened. He explained how the boss's demands tightened in the mid-1980 seconds, convincing earners that performance didn't guarantee safety. That fear seeded cooperation. Other men followed. A collector with a quick grin who wore a wire. A lieutenant who had sat at celebratory dinners and later traded truths for smaller numbers. Their stories aligned with ledgers, phone logs, and surveillance reports. Together they painted a machine that ran hot, fast, and loud, until the law adapted and broke it apart. In court and through lawyers, he kept rejecting the way history was being written. He insisted the government had turned neighborhood meals into conspiracy maps, and that cooperators gilded their tales to earn deals. There's truth in suspicion of self-serving witnesses. Yet the weight of tapes, documents, and repeating methods outlasted those arguments. Appeals reshaped edges of cases but not the core. He remained in federal custody on a rack of sentences that stretched beyond natural life. The calendar, once a tool he used to set meetings and deadlines, became a wall. Personal grief threaded through the legal storyline. A teenage son, breaking under the pressure of attention, attempted to end his life during the storm of 1988 and survived with injuries that remade every day for that family. Another son tried to prove himself in the life and caught bullets at a crowded restaurant in 1989, surviving in a way that turned the attack into city lore. He later moved out of the old orbit and into ventures that ended with corporate fraud counts decades later. Those chapters needed no graphic description to carry weight. They showed what proximity to power based on fear can do to people who never voted for that path. Time didn't blunt his appetite for control. He found a modern version in the 2000s when a weakened public mortgage company offered a fresh angle. Associates amassed board seats. The firm started buying businesses from entities the insiders controlled, paying at inflated prices and justifying the deals with consulting and advisory contracts that generated monthly cash. That cash circled back to the same people who had approved the deals. Prosecutors later showed how messages from prison kept him in the loop and ensured he received tribute by proxy. It was the old method, wrapped in corporate paper. Capture the gate. Tax the flow. Investigators followed emails, minutes, wire transfers, and phone calls. A jury convicted his son and the audacious dealmaker who drove the scheme. Additional years landed on the father, already serving a term that left no daylight at the end. Shareholders saw savings evaporate. Employees lost jobs. The boardroom learned an old lesson. Capture can come wearing a tie. Meanwhile, the Philadelphia landscape kept evolving. The caretaker tied to the Bruno era ended up in his own case and sentence. The younger South Philadelphia figure who had fought him did time, and later tried to recast himself as a restaurateur who liked attention but not surveillance vans. A former boss from the 1990 seconds became a government witness, an extraordinary development that shook old beliefs about silence at the top. Crews thinned. New alliances formed with less deference to geography and lineage. The big picture didn't look like the 1980 seconds anymore. It looked smaller, more cautious, and far more vulnerable to modern scrutiny. Institutions that had once been levers under his hand hardened against outside capture. Union locals adopted election rules that made proxies harder to hide. Casinos kept deeper files on vendors, with regulators able to audit ownership chains. Contractors learned to watch for consulting fees that showed up only when deliveries slowed. State and federal offices coordinated in a way that prevented cases from falling through jurisdictional cracks. None of it felt dramatic. It felt like policy, checklists, and patience. Yet that quiet architecture is what makes an old system fail to reboot when a new face tries to revive it. He aged into a medical unit where monitors beeped and fluorescent lights washed color out of afternoons. The routine of a hard man softened into pills, blood draws, and careful walks watched by staff. Even there, with time carving new lines in his face, he held on to the same posture and the belief that a nod still mattered. Visitors, fewer each year, brought stories from neighborhoods he had not seen in decades. He asked about old corners, old names, old money streams. They answered in polite tones, sidestepping the obvious. Proximity powers fear. Distance drains it. In quiet moments, memory drifted back to Atlantic City's rise. He had been sent there as a safety valve, an exile to keep his temper away from Bruno's polished order. The exile became his making when casinos arrived. Concrete contracts, delivery schedules, food services, uniforms, waste hauling, every function turned into a point where leverage meant money. He taxed each point, then demanded tribute across the city after the bomb, and the street war cleared his path upward. The approach worked until it didn't. The very scale that made him powerful created scores of people who could later walk into a grand jury room and explain, step by step, how that scale functioned. His answer, tightening control and shrinking trust, produced more witnesses. It's a loop that breaks in one direction only. Journalists and former agents, now professors and consultants, taught classes using his era as a case study. They showed students how enterprise prosecutions work, how to tie together a card game, a loan contract, a rigged union election, and a bid-rigging scheme into one narrative that a jury can follow. They didn't need movie clips. They used transcripts, ledgers, and tape excerpts in plain voices. When those classes turned to reform, they pointed to trusteeships of unions, vendor audits, and procurement rules as answers. In that sense, his legacy crossed from headlines to handbooks. The people who had lived under his thumb told their stories too. Contractors remembered bids padded to include cutouts and shell firms. Union members recalled meetings where ballots felt pointless, then the strange sensation of real elections under outside monitors. Small business owners spoke about loans that started with a handshake and ended with demands that devoured profit. None of these voices needed to amplify the drama. Their strength came from understatement. Pay, wait, hope the truck comes on time. Repeat. That monotony, that tax on the ordinary, is what communities eventually refuse. Lawyers kept filing papers in his name, challenging counts, raising procedural questions, pushing for resentencing on narrow grounds. Some motions found traction. A line in a verdict form got reinterpreted. A specific count fell away. A term shifted on a sheet. The overall picture didn't budge. He remained a long-term federal inmate, with additional years tacked on after the corporate case. Each new docket felt like a reminder that the state fights as patiently as it punishes. He rarely spoke to cameras. Short statements through counsel, stoic walks into courtrooms, a seat at defense tables flanked by marshals. Those images replaced the old street theater. People who expected a lady-life confession got silence. People who expected a lady-life reinvention got the same steady refusal. Pride had built his rise, and also built a wall between him and any softer revision of his story. By then, the talk in neighborhoods had shifted. Instead of asking who sat at which table, people asked which rules kept a union clean, which contracts protected a job site, which oversight kept vendors honest. Younger workers grew up knowing that a compliance email mattered more than a whispered phone number. Older men, those still alive, shook their heads and told the younger ones what it had been like when a name could move a delivery from next week to tomorrow morning. The younger ones nodded and went back to work. Through it all, the lessons felt less like proclamations and more like everyday truths. A city that runs on fear runs hot and breaks. A city that runs on rules finds ways to cool down. When someone pushes every lever for personal gain, the system eventually notices and starts installing locks. When someone insists respect equals fear, they end up alone, because fear fades in absence, and respect without trust doesn't hold. He had wanted permanence. He built speed. The two rarely traveled together for long. Late afternoons in the medical wing stretched into long evenings with television news playing stories about places he once controlled. Reporters spoke about reform, elections, trials with different names, compliance orders, and small triumphs that would never trend. He listened, measured each word, and kept his posture. The state kept its rhythm. The neighborhoods kept theirs. The shore lights kept blinking. The city understood what it had survived and how it had adapted. The man who had tried to bend it by force kept breathing under institutional light, living proof that even the most determined will eventually meet a clock it cannot intimidate. Winter settled over a medical unit where lights hummed and corridors smelled of disinfectant. He woke to checks by nurses, answered questions clipped and short, and watched the clock more than the TV. At 87, the man who once chose the hour of every meeting now accepted routines set by others. Federal Medical Center Butner in North Carolina had become his last address. Staff noted vitals, recorded medications, and moved on to the next bed. Visitors dwindled. The people who came brought news from a city he hadn't walked in decades. Stories about corners, restaurants, and faces that had once jumped at a single word from him. The gap between those stories and the beeping monitors explained more than any obituary would later manage. He had reached that room through choices stacked across a lifetime. Born in Brooklyn in 1929, raised on tight South Philadelphia blocks, he learned early who nodded and who waited. Short, combustible, never content to play a background role, he attached himself to men who controlled gambling, loans, and unions. A stabbing in the early 960 seconds, led to a manslaughter conviction and a prison term that taught him patience instead of restraint. Angelo Bruno, the measured boss who prized quiet profits, pushed him to Atlantic City to keep the peace at home. He turned exile into opportunity. Rooms over card games, back stairways near kitchens, lounges at seasonal hotels, he mapped them all and turned leverage into a daily habit. Casino legalization transformed the shore into a construction yard that hummed day and night. He inserted himself at the choke points. Concrete, trucking, uniforms, waste, vendors, builders later described a club, a closed circle for pours and deliveries that came with fees dressed up as dues. If a firm joined, salutes followed, and jobs moved. If a firm balked, delays appeared. He pressed into the hospitality union as well. Elections, appointments, contract talks, each provided an opening to install friendly names who could quiet walkouts and steer business toward approved suppliers. Years later, a judge placed that local under trusteeship. Ballots were rerun, books opened, and monitors installed. Even in that reform, people could see his outline. The Atlantic City engine made him rich and relevant until the map at home shifted. Bruno was killed in 1980, a breach the national overseers never approved. His successor died in an explosion a year later. Philadelphia shook. In the scramble, he sought recognition to run the family. With outside nods and a tightly knit inner ring, he took the chair. He appointed an old neighborhood figure to act as underboss and elevated his nephew, a bright operator who absorbed lessons fast. Tribute became policy. Bookmakers, loan collectors, union contacts, construction fixers, everyone paid up. He believed fear kept engines tuned. He revved them hard. Resistance rose from a seasoned capo who refused to bend. Their conflict stretched across years, punctuated by attacks and arrests. A trusted counselor, prized for diplomacy, was killed during that feud, ending any chance of winnowing differences through talk. Detectives stayed patient, gathered wiretaps and statements, and brought the older rival to trial for murder. The sentence was life. On the street, the message read like a victory for the man at the top. In courtrooms and surveillance rooms, it looked like the opening of a larger case against all of them. Investigators had the rhythm now. They saw how loans, bets, union pressure, and construction deals fit together. Control tightened. He demanded more. A young earner with a famous last name, known for discipline and steady profits, found himself marked as a potential threat. The boss gave the order to remove him, a decision that broke an unspoken promise. Performance would protect you. It didn't. That single act chilled his own circle. Men who had believed they could work their way into safety now understood there was none. When the government arrived with a sprawling racketeering indictment later in the 1980 seconds, those same men listened to lawyers explain decades. Some decided to talk. The racketeering trials that followed presented patterns instead of just scenes. Jurors heard about the Shore's concrete ring, union manipulation, card rooms, loans that doubled payments until businesses snapped, and the use of violence to silence dissent. They saw diagrams, transcripts, financial records. Defense attorneys argued cooperators were inventing to save themselves. Yet, tapes, bank trails, and consistent methods held the narrative together. In 1988, guilty verdicts landed: racketeering, extortion, illegal gambling, and murder-related counts. He received a term that stretched beyond any realistic life expectancy. The nephew, once the fast-rising underboss, took a heavy sentence too. Then came the unexpected turn that made history books. The nephew flipped. He sat with agents and prosecutors, told them how money moved from betting slips and loading docks into envelopes and accounts, how union allies were chosen, how meetings were set and coded, how paranoia replaced prudence. He testified in multiple trials. A collector with a gift for small talk wore a wire. A veteran lieutenant who had cheered promotions exchanged testimony for a shorter horizon. The myth that fear guarantees loyalty failed under fluorescent lights. Each cooperator added detail to a machine that the law had already begun to dismantle. From prison, he tried to run the old routes. He chose a caretaker with ties to Bruno's style and told him to keep gambling lines crisp, collectors careful, and envelopes moving with minimal noise. Outside, the air had changed. Bookmakers met with agents. Bar owners saved voicemails. Union locals lived under rewritten bylaws and outside monitors. A brash, younger faction in South Philadelphia challenged the caretaker, bringing another round of havoc in the early 1,990 seconds that ended with more cases and more long terms. He watched through glass, powerless to impose calm. Command without presence became memory exercise. The personal cost cut deep. In 1988, a teenage son living inside the spotlight his father had created attempted to end his life. He survived with injuries that changed every day afterwards. In 1989, another son, eager to prove himself, was attacked at a crowded restaurant and lived by inches. He later stepped beyond Philadelphia and became central to a corporate fraud case decades later. These events do not require lurid detail to carry their weight. They show what the glare of notoriety and the pressure of fear do to households, not just to men on street corners. Time delivered a new kind of scheme. In the 2000s, a Texas mortgage firm battered by a lending bust became the target of a takeover. Associates tied to his son went after board seats, installed friendly executives, and approved deals that steered company cash to entities they controlled. Consulting and advisory contracts guaranteed monthly payments regardless of performance. It was the tribute model expressed in filings rather than whispers. Prosecutors traced emails, minutes, wire transfers, and calls. They showed how messages from prison kept the elder in the loop and ensured a cut flowed to him. In 2014 and 2015, a jury convicted the son and the flamboyant dealmaker who drove the raid. More years were added to the father's ledger. The company collapsed. Employees and investors paid the tab. Age made itself known. He transferred to medical units where staff measured pressure and blood sugar and moved him carefully between appointments. He kept the straight posture as long as he could. He preserved his style questions short, conclusions sharper when visitors came. He asked about old corners, old allies, and the last family names still active. The replies grew thinner. The city had moved on. The older caretaker had gone to prison. The younger 1,990 seconds leader had served time and later tried to build a public life around restaurants and press. A former top figure turned witness. A shock that once would have been unthinkable. Crews merged, splintered, found new partners. The underworld he had tried to lock down became smaller and more fragile under modern scrutiny. Obituaries arrived before the end in the form of long magazine pieces and books that treated him not as a legend but as a lesson. Writers laid out the cast and the calendar. Angelo Bruno's quiet years, the 1,960 seconds manslaughter case, the exile that led to Atlantic City, the casino rush that made that exile profitable, the concrete ring, the union capture and later trusteeship, the Rickabine feud, the killing of his own advisor, the removal of a rising star with a famous name, the racketeering trials, the nephew's cooperation, the attempts to run the family from a cell, the 1,992nd Street chaos he could not stop, and the corporate fraud that landed near the end. They avoided glamour. They wrote as if outlining a civics case study. That tone felt right. One January night in 2017, the monitors went quiet. He died of natural causes at Bootner, far from the shore air and the South Philadelphia stoops, where he had first dreamed of being untouchable. News outlets noted the age 87, the setting of Federal Medical Center, and the arc of a life measured in indictments, trials, and reforms that followed. There were no long motorcades, no public processions. The world he had ruled by fear dwindled to a portion of a page and a few minutes on the evening news. Then even that moved on. After his death, the city's conversation turned practical, not elegiac. People asked what had changed because of his years, and what held up after he was gone. The answers were bureaucratic and real. Union elections under new rules, vendor audits at casinos, procurement transparency for contractors, a habit of cooperation among agencies that once competed, and communities more willing to share information early. His tenure had forced institutions to modernize. Those guardrails did not fade when his name left headlines. They became part of how the region worked. Families whose lives intersected with his choices told quieter stories. A contractor remembered bidding for a concrete job knowing the numbers would be padded to include partners he had never met. A cardroom regular recalled paying a percentage each week, because that was the cost of making book in a busy town. A hotel housekeeper described union meetings that once felt scripted, then the strange relief of real ballots counted under watchful eyes. None spoke with drama. Their calm made the point. A constant tax on the ordinary is the hardest weight to notice until it lifts. People who still admire hard talk sometimes frame him as proof that will can bend a city. The record shows something else. He bent it for a while by equating respect with fear. Then he broke his own support by squeezing too hard. The more he demanded, the less cover he provided in return. Loyal earners looked up and saw targets on their backs. Neighbors saw no path to safety, except through law. Prosecutors learned to present patterns instead of episodes. Judges appointed trustees to unions and approved compliance remedies that closed old back doors. That is why his rule ended in a wave of convictions, and why no one after him could rebuild the same machine at the same scale. If you gather the facts without red ink or gold leaf, you get a clean outline. A boy left Brooklyn for South Philadelphia and learned the codes of his block. A short fuse and a relentless need to be seen pushed him into a life that rewarded leverage. A prison stretch early on served as a lesson in patience, not mercy. Exile to Atlantic City laid a runway. A casino boom gave him a chance to tax concrete, uniforms, and deliveries, and to sway a union. Murders were ordered to secure position. A war with a defiant capo pulled the city apart. Racketeering law caught up with him. The nephew testified. He tried to rule from inside, and failed. A boardroom scam later added time. He died in custody. The city adjusted its defenses and kept going. The simplest distillation fits in a sentence. Power gained by fear looks solid until it isn't. It holds fast only while people stay quiet. When the costs spread to families, when rivals see that even star performers can be struck, when institutions modernize, fear loses altitude. Respect tied to threat collapses. His life, documented in court records across decades, is proof. The pages describe crimes without romance. Extortion, illegal gambling, loan sharking, union corruption, bid rigging, violent orders meant to enforce tribute, and, near the end, a corporate raid carried out with signatures instead of fists. The punishments follow plainly. Decades behind fences, added years for the corporate case, a final stretch in a medical wing. Some nights along the shore, wind rattles hotel flags the way it did when the boardwalk first rose toward neon in the late 1970 seconds. Inside, slot floors hum, dealers flip cards, and tourists never sense the history under their feet. In South Philadelphia, row houses glow warm over dinner tables where grandparents tell stories that sound like fables until they point to yellowed clippings. The moral in those rooms stays modest and clear. Strength without proportion consumes itself. Silence isn't loyalty. It's a pause that ends when pressure grows too loud. Communities can learn. Systems can change. A man can choose a path and walk it hard, only to learn that the calendar writes the last paragraph. He once chased permanence, convinced that a name spoken in a low voice could outlive courts and clocks. He got a different sort of permanence. Case law, compliance manuals, and union bylaws that still shape decisions. That is his monument, if he has one. Built not of stone, but of procedures that thwart the mix of greed and intimidation he perfected. It does not recite his lines. It doesn't have to. The absence of his method in daily work is the legacy that endures. If you listen close on a quiet night, you can still hear the boardwalk breath and the city's low murmur. The lights blink. The rooms fill. The streets go on. The man at the center of this story is gone, leaving behind a record that teaches without spectacle and a map of how ambition, left unchecked, turns on itself. He wanted the last word. The last word belongs to time, to neighborhoods that rebuilt, to workers who cast honest votes, to investigators who followed patterns, and to a city that decided fear no longer set its clock. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Nicodemo Scarfo here, thanking you for joining me on this quiet journey through discipline, loyalty, and the cost of power. If this story helped you unwind or drift into sleep, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Over 90% of our viewers watch but haven't subscribed yet, so if you enjoyed this one, your support truly helps us keep these powerful tales alive. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories reach. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.